It's my pleasure to introduce Raaz Dwivedi here, who's a sixth-year graduate student at UC Berkeley, who has an interest in both the theoretical and applied aspects of statistical machine learning and data science. He has done a few stints at Microsoft Research, where he has some collaborators. He graduated in 2014 from IIT Bombay with a BTech in honors in electrical engineering and a minors in mathematics. And today he will be talking to us about how some of his work on rethinking complexity and the bias-variance trade-off. So Raaz, without further ado, the floor is yours, and you have 20 minutes, which will follow up by questions.
Okay. Thank you, Demba, for this wonderful introduction, and thanks for having me here. It's really a delight to be presenting some of the recent works. This is joint work with Chandan Singh, who's a PhD student, and my PhD advisors, Binu and Martin Wainwright. And let's bring this logo of the workshop right into the center. This talk is, the work started when we were trying to understand this double descent behavior that has arisen in many modern ML settings. And compared to the traditional bias-variance trade-off, where there's a U shape, these ones typically have a second descent as the complexity of the fitted models increase. So on the y-axis is I think the audience is pretty familiar with this kind of a curve by now, but just to put everything in the context. So the y-axis is showing the risk, and the x-axis shows the complexity of the models. And as in many papers and many works, it has been shown that in contrast to the classical settings, where this, as you increase the complexity, the risk used to go down and then go up again. In modern settings, after some interpolation threshold in some overparameterized settings, there is a second descent and where the risk starts going down again. And in this plot, the thing that I would like you to take away is that on the x-axis lies complexity, like typically model complexity, and that's not a very well-defined notion, but it's typically taken to be the parameter count. And bias-variance trade-off refers to this shape, the origin of this shape, where there is some sort of characterization of bias and variance, the decomposition of this risk into two terms, variance and bias. And it's typically assumed that the bias, as the complexity goes down, as complexity increases, the bias should go down, while the variance goes up because you have a more and more complex models. But note that like this kind of a shape or this kind of trade-off was originally established for several low dimensional settings. And it was shown for, I would say, like a class of good estimators. Let me clarify it a bit. So first thing I would like to make clear is that we should study a trade-off for a fixed data. Like in many papers, there is often the data generating model changes as we move on the x-axis. So in this talk, we'll fix the data, and only the fitted model would change as you move on the x-axis. And implicitly, we would like to change the complexity of the fitted model as we move from one side to the other side. And from this plot, I would like to draw attention to the fact that people often say that bias-variance trade-off doesn't hold in modern settings, but if you look at some bad estimators, the bias-variance trade-off, you don't expect to hold for any estimator, like any trivial estimator. For example, zero estimator doesn't show any trade-off. The error is constant in a linear model setting, for instance. Or when you have poor covariate design, you can have multiple descent easily with an min-norm OLS estimator. So the point here I'm trying to make is that one should expect a bias-variance trade-off when there is a good estimator. For example, if you repeat this linear regression experiment with a rich estimator by tuning it, you'll see the typical U-shaped curve pop up again. But if you look at the OLS estimator or a zero estimator or a OLS estimator with poor covariates, you might see different kinds of behavior. The other thing that the other part in this figure that the rest of the talk cares about is the x-axis. Is like typically in the recent works, this x-axis is taken to be d over n, where d is the number of features and n is the number of samples. So d is like the parameter count, and the question we want to ask is that a valid complexity measure? And well, complexity itself is a tricky concept. It's starting somewhat with the Kolmogorov's algorithmic complexity of the description of the shortest program. But in stats and ML, the typical usage that people want to, the typical way people want to use complexity is trying to understand the generalization error. And they would like to decompose this test error as sum of training error plus complexity over some a function of the sample size. N will denote the sample size. And this kind of characterization is useful because then it helps you select models or like pick a best model from a family of models. And Occam's razor says that one should pick the simplest model that gives you a good fit. So in according to this, the x-axis on bias-variance trade-off for this risk characterization should be this kind of complexity, but it's often vaguely defined and by default taken to be parameter count. And the reason for it to be parameter count, like you can try to trace it back, and it can be attributed primarily to the various notions of complexity that were derived for linear models. So starting with AIC, the AIC criterion gives you a direct complexity of d over 2. Then BIC, it gives you d over 2 log n. If you try to derive Rademacher complexities, again of order d, degrees of freedom order d, VC dimension d, and the minimum description length complexity is also of order d, slightly different. It's like BIC. And so this kind of, like for linear models, this popping up of d across these complexity measures has perhaps led to this usage of parameter count as the complexity measures, even when we go to the overparameterized settings. But if you go back and look at the derivation of all these complexities, it was done in low dimensional settings and often in asymptotic settings. And in those cases, it was kind of well justified because OLS was shown to be a good estimator, in fact, achieving the minimax error, which scaled like order d over n. So this kind of a complexity made sense. But for overparameterized setting, taking this notion of complexity or using parameter directly is often criticized and perhaps not well placed. So and of course they don't work, and they are not really rigorously well justified. So in this talk, we try to derive some data dependent complexity using minimum description length, which is not just parameter count. And I would like to show you some favorable properties of our derivations and like the advantages of using such a non-parameter count like complexity. So just to briefly recap the principle of MDL, it's some sort of formalism of Occam's razor, saying that you should choose the model that gives the shortest description of data. And it has the roots in Kolmogorov's complexity, but it was made computable using probability distributions and using Shannon's information theory. And there have been many versions of MDL over the years. Perhaps the earliest one were the simplest ones, the two-stage MDL, while more modern ones being normalized maximum likelihood. So the underlying principle with MDL is you see each model, each generating model or each fitted model as a probability distribution, and you try to see it as a probability encoding in the information theoretic sense. And a good fit of a model is seen as a shorter code length or a shorter description of data. So in that sense, it's a very reasonable principle that you want to pick a code that has a shorter code length, and which is same as saying you want to pick a model that has a good fit. So in terms of what do I mean by code? So for given any model, it induces a distribution on the output space Y. And for each observation small y, we associate log 1 over qy bits in the information theoretic sense, because for any distribution, you can associate a code that has roughly log 1 over qy bits associated for encoding the observation y. So this kind of interpretation by itself doesn't need a generative model. Instead, each model is seen as an encoding, and the shorter the encoding or the shorter code length it provides, the more preferred that encoding should be, or the more preferred that model should be. So in MDL, you often try to ask this question: what is the optimal code? What is the optimal code length? And that gives rise to this notion of complexity. So in case you know what the true model is or the true data generating mechanism is, you can try to ask what is the optimal code. And the way to ask this question is, suppose you have a code Q, the expected code length is log 1 over qy, and take an expectation over p star. And this is minimized using standard algebra. You can write this as KL divergence plus the entropy, KL divergence between p star and q. This KL divergence is often called the redundancy, the excess code length, because you're not using the true model p star. And from this easy decomposition, you can see that this expected code length is minimized when q is equal to p star. And another optimal property of p star is that it minimizes the worst case regret. So regret is the worst case difference between the encoding for an observation y using this code q minus the original, the true distribution log 1 over P star Y. And then you try to maximize this over all observations, and then you minimize over all possible codes. This gives you P star. So MDL principle is nice in the sense that if you know the true model, it says the true model is the best possible encoding, and that's what you should use. So, but when P star is unknown, and that's what will motivate the later definitions in this talk, then the definition becomes slightly complicated and it takes a different path. This is where you can see this is some sort of generalization of maximum likelihood principle. So given a class of models P theta, not necessarily containing the true distribution, the generalization of the min-max regret is that you try to compare the regret for a given distribution Q with the best possible code length for that observation Y over the parametric class. And in the 1980s, the fundamental result was shown by Shatarkov that argued that there is a distribution that minimizes this worst case regret. And it's given by QNML. NML stands for normalized maximum likelihood, which is proportional to, for any Y, you maximize P theta Y. So this gives you up to proportionality, and you convert this into a probability distribution by normalizing it. So this kind of an encoding provides you the best possible, it gives you the best regret in this worst case sense, when even if P star is not known. And this complexity, there is a complexity associated with this procedure, which is basically the log normalization constant, which is both the worst case and the average regret of this class of codes. And it is referred to as the NML or Shatarkov of complexity for this set of distributions. And reason ensured that for a d-dimensional parametric class, this also simplifies to d over 2 log n. So again, it degenerates to parameter count. But so this is where we start to take slightly different path, because when this is infinite, this NML distribution is ill-defined, and people try to take different paths, different strategies to fix it. So even for linear models, actually, this complexity is infinite by the way it was defined. So for linear models, the encoding that you would consider would be just a Gaussian and Gaussian codes. So normal centered at x theta, wherein sigma is square in. We assume x and sigma is square are known. And then in this case, the NML distribution would be given by up to proportionality expected minus the x theta OLS minus y square. So when you maximize over theta, you are basically substituting theta is equal to theta OLS. And you can see easily that this kind of a distribution integrates to infinity if the output space is unbounded or is like d-dimensional Euclidean space. Like the simplest way to think about this is, suppose you pick, you consider the overparameterized setting, then x theta hat OLS minus y is 0, where I'm referring to OLS as the min norm OLS. So you're integrating constant over the Euclidean space and it is unbounded. So your normalization constant is infinite and this complexity is not well defined. So people often truncate the output space, which does not give you interesting results in overparameterized settings and is of limited interest in context of this talk. We use regularization and define a modified NML complexity. So what do I mean by that? So instead of maximizing just the code length or just the code P theta Y, we use a weighting function W theta. And it's in MDL literature, it's called the luckiness factor. And in our case, we use ridge regularization and W theta is informed by it. So instead of just maximizing or minimizing the least squares objective, you're now minimizing the ridge objective. So that would give you a different luckiness and NML encoding, and given by this formula that instead of OLS, now you plug in the ridge estimator, and this gives you another code on the space of outcomes. And note that this code does integrate to finite number as long as lambda is positive or positive definite. If lambda is 0, it integrates to infinity. So now you have this family of codes. So in the MDL sense, to get a complexity measure, you would like to minimize this redundancy over this family of codes induced by these ridge estimators. So we in particular consider lambda, this hyperparameter of the form UDU transpose, where D is some positive semi-definite diagonal matrix, and use the eigenvectors of the X transpose X. We are in the linear model setting. And now, because lambda is a hyperparameter, you have to also account for its code length, and we use a simple discretization based code length. That the detail is not that important. And this leads to finally the definition of MDL-COMP, which is given by, first you optimize the redundancy. So find the best possible code in this rich class. And then you also account for the code length needed to encode the optimal hyperparameters. And this gives you an MDL-COMP that is defined for all D and for all N. And for a generative model where Y is generated from X theta star plus Gaussian noise, we have analytical expressions. This is a function of data, like it's not parameter count, it's an explicit function of data. Here, the row i's denote the eigenvalues of this the X transpose X matrix. Wi denotes the rotated signal, and sigma denotes the variance in the variance of the noise. So this kind of an expression, if you try to unpack this for different kind of designs, it's a very explicit expression, and you can try to unpack for different kinds of design. For Gaussian, you can decompose it into various cases when D lies between 1 to D star to number of samples to infinity. Here D star is the true dimensionality of the data. And these expressions are not that important. Let me show you their qualitative behavior on a plot. And here I'm showing some simulations, and you see that the MDL-COMP scales like D over N in the low parameter, in the under parameterized settings where D is less than N, and it scales very slowly like log D in over parameterized settings. So this is suggesting that the default choice of D as the complexity measure is perhaps not good in the over parameterized setting. Of course, our derivations were based on rich class, and if you try to take some other class, you may get slightly different scaling. But the bottom line here is that in high dimensions, we tried to take a different path to derive a complexity measure, and we got something that is not just parameter count, and it has a much slower scaling of the order log D in over parameterized settings. So there are some other optimality properties for MDL-COMP that I do not have the time to go into. And I would like to mention that we derived it for linear models, but you can extend it to kernel methods, and like in a straightforward manner for neural tangent kernels. So this kind of notion is useful in the sense that it tries to take a step back to derive a valid notion of complexity for over parameter settings. But the question is, what do we do with such a complexity notion? Can we make it useful for practice? And for now, while we are still trying to work our way, like our notion of MDL-COMP is useful for in-sample risk, but for out-of-sample risk, we only have some qualitative justifications from simulations. And we also use MDL-COMP to inform some hyperparameter tuning, which is pretty competitive to cross-validation. Since I'm running out of time, I'll just give you a brief snapshot, and I'll refer you to the paper for more details. So the goal is you can find a data version, like the previous notion of MDL-COMP was Oracle. We can define a data version of it, and we can use this data version of the MDL-COMP to tune the hyperparameter for rich regression. The term showed in red is the additional term that you add to the ridge objective and minimize over lambda. And we show via many simulations that test MSE, if like when you try to minimize this practical MDL-COMP objective, test MSE also gets, like, it doesn't get exactly minimized, but it does get like to a pretty low value. And when we try to use this kind of Prac-MDL-COMP based tuning, we remove the double descent, as is done if you tune ridge using cross-validation. Perhaps the most important thing is if you use this kind of a procedure or use Prac-MDL-COMP for hyperparameter tuning, you save a lot of computation when compared to k-fold cross-validation, and while not losing in terms of performance. So I will just end on this slide, trying to make a case that Prac-MDL-COMP does help with hyperparameter tuning. So there are 3 settings here on a ton of data sets from PMLB database. And you can see here that the x-axis shows performance for cross-validation, while y-axis shows the performance for Prac-MDL-COMP. and we have plotted the y is equal to x line. So if there is a data point, if there is a point below the y is equal to x line, that means Prac-MDL-COMP is winning over cross-validation. And the takeaway from this plot is when D is larger than N or is close to N, Prac-MDL-COMP provides competitive performance and often better than the tuning done by cross-validation. And note that Prac-MDL-COMP doesn't do many folds. It's a single fold computation. So it does provide you like a k times computation advantage. And so to summarize, there are many more experiments. To summarize, we took a modified normalized maximum likelihood approach to define a new complexity measure using optimal ridge estimators. And we derived a complexity which is not just parameter count, but a function of the design matrix and other things. You can extend it to kernel methods, and it provides a competitive to cross validation, but computationally more efficient hyperparameter tuning scheme. So thank you. And I hope I ended on time.
Thank you, Raaz. Yeah, we have enough time for, I think, at least 2 or 3 questions. I'm going to get to them at present. Let's thank him first. Thank you. So the first questions come from Hamid Javadi. Is there anything special about ridge that makes it appropriate to use for this class? Can there be another class that gives a smaller complexity?
That's a very good question. And the short answer is yes, that you can use another class that can give you a smaller complexity. So in that sense, the complexity derived in our paper should be seen as upper bounds. And the reason why we use ridge estimators is perhaps best illustrated from this plot, that tuned ridge estimators do show this regular U-shaped bias-variance trade-off. And that's why we were like, ridge does provide you, like ridge estimators are also known to provide Bayes optimal risk. So our goal was to define codes that are coming from a good class of estimators. So that's why we went for ridge. And another, I guess, technical reason is ridge-based codes allow you to derive closed form expressions. While if you go for some other kind of codes, then you have to do some kind of approximation.
Great. Thanks for that, Raj. There's a question here by Reinhardt. He's thanking you for the nice talk, and he's asking about the generalization to the NTA kernel and whether it's along the following lines that I'll try to summarize. To first compute the NTA Jacobian for a wide network, and then compute MDL from the singular values of the NTK Jacobian. If they decay quickly, then is the MDL large? Is that the analogy?
So that's a great question. And the answer is yes, like for NTK, because it's just a kernel, like if you can do things for ridge regression, you can easily extend things for kernel ridge regression. So you have this, once you have the kernel, you just compute the eigenvalues of the kernel. And then you should have some upper bound on the Hilbert norm of the function you're estimating. And then you can trade off these, like a particular kind of sum between the two. And for when you're trying to use some other approximations, like we can perhaps come up with approximate MDL-COMP using Jacobians, but we are still trying to work on, like, can we derive some more neater closed form expressions? And in terms of if they decay quickly, then MDL is large. No, I think you mentioned correction of question. Yes. So if the eigenvalues decay quickly, then MDL is small. It's and like I can also say that if you look at the MDL expressions after optimizing, they look like the best possible in-sample risk. So if your eigenvalues are decaying like I to the minus alpha, where I is the index of the eigenvalue, then the MDL expression decays roughly like n to the minus 2 alpha by 2 alpha plus 1 in one dimension. So like the best possible in-sample risk. So if you have faster decay, MDL is decaying, MDL is small.
Okay, great. Thanks, Raaz. And I have a last question for you. At a high level, is one of your points that this double descent phenomenon might be a property of the estimators that are being considered? Is that one of your points?
Yes, that is one of the points. And like, so we often study the double descent when the generative model is changing as you move on the x-axis. So like we are trying to say that first we should fix the data and then change the fitted models. That is first thing. And the second thing is the kind of model you should consider should be some good class of models. Otherwise, you might have funny things happening for no good reason. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Raaz. And we ended in time. Let's thank him again for a great talk and for a great Q&A session.